carbon has infiltrated all aspects of our life, and we need to decarbonize our lifestyles. And each one of us is going to bring a distinct perspective and strength to that decarbonization process. And since we need everybody to be doing everything, we really just need people to take whatever they're passionate about and apply that in the three arenas that we all operate: your personal life, your work life, and your community life, right? And work in each one of those arenas to have conversations about how are we going to decarbonize.
Welcome to the Earthkeepers podcast. This podcast is for people who seek new and better ways to love and care for the earth. It's a podcast for anyone who is deeply concerned about the harm being done to the environment on a local and global level. It's a podcast that builds community and connection between people of like heart and mind, people who believe that earth care should be integrated into every aspect of life, and for many in the Earthkeepers community, that includes our spiritual lives. If you're listening to this podcast, chances are you care a lot about caring for creation and about working against the unfolding climate crisis. However, as worthy as those aspirations might be, many of us don't have a clear sense of how our distinctive abilities and passions translate to climate action. And when we don't have a sense of our unique role to play in solving climate issues, it makes it that much harder for us to be part of collective community efforts to that end. In this episode, I'll be talking to teamwork consultant Matt Schlegel. Matt is the author of the book Teamwork 9.0 and host of the show Leadership Path of Growth on YouTube. In his unique approach to earth care, he employs the Enneagram, a system of 9 personality types combining traditional wisdom with modern psychology. For many, the Enneagram is a powerful tool for understanding themselves and the people in their lives. For Matt Schlegel, it's a framework for accelerating progress on climate initiatives and guiding communities with the steps of problem solving towards resolution. Welcome, friends, to the Earthkeepers podcast. Matt, welcome to the Earthkeepers podcast. Perhaps you could start our conversation off by telling us about your professional life and the sort of work that you do.
Yeah, great. Thank you so much for having me on your show, Forrest. It's a delight to be here. I started out my career as an engineer and studied science and engineering and went through my early career doing electrical engineering. And at some point, my manager came to me and said, "Hey, Matt, we want you to lead a team." And I'm like, "Why do you want me to lead a team? I know nothing about leading people. I only know about leading electrons." And he says, "Don't worry, you'll be fine." And of course, that's not my nature. I wasn't fine. I was worried. So I studied a lot about teamwork and leadership and really took it to heart about what it meant to be a team leader. And along the way, I discovered the system called the Enneagram. And I don't know if you're familiar with the Enneagram.
I am. Mm-hmm.
Oh, great. And by the time I came across Enneagram, I'd already studied DISC and Myers-Briggs and Strength Finders and all the other tools that a manager tends to learn. And as I worked with the Enneagram, I found that it was a bit more profound than the other systems. It seemed more accurate at describing motivations and the underlying perspectives of people and my teammates. And as I used it more, I found that it really helped both me and my team understand each other's perspectives, where they're coming from, and learn how to communicate with each other better. So just fascinating. And that's just the first step on the journey that led me to do the teamwork consulting that I do now.
You consult about leadership, but you've also made issues of earth care a core part of your message. I'm wondering, what changes or commitments do you try to inspire in the people that you influence day to day?
Well, that's an interesting question. And what I really try to do is to help people appreciate, through whatever means, the Enneagram or whatever works for them, to appreciate that different people bring different perspectives. And we tend to like people like ourselves, birds of a feather flock together, that type of thing. And for leaders and managers, they often hire people like themselves because it's easier for them. And I think it's important to understand that we need to break out of that particular habit and learn to appreciate and value the diversity of perspectives on your team, especially in the context of problem solving. And so that's one of the things that I try to emphasize with the people that I work with.
So when it comes to earth care in particular, and you talk about decarbonizing our lifestyles, for example, what motivates you to really make that such a core part of your message? What is it that has influenced you in your formation that has caused you to have this as a major part of your message?
Right. Well, I've been on this beat for a long time. I became aware of the climate crisis in the 80s when I was studying science, and I was studying physical chemistry, which is kind of the underlying science of how atmospheric science works. And it was really obvious to me, the putting in greenhouse gases into the atmosphere, you're going to warm the atmosphere. And we were doing it at unsustainable levels, and we needed to stop doing that. We needed to get off of burning fossil fuels. Simple as that. And even at that point in my life, I was thinking, wow, as a person living in the United States, I have extraordinarily high emissions compared to global averages. And so what does that mean? And what can I do in my life to make sure that I'm not overly contributing? And so these thoughts were already swirling around in my young head. But then you find a girl, you get married, you have kids, you get a job, and, you kind of go through that path all the while thinking that, well, it'll be okay, right? I mean, we already know about it. We already know about the problem. So all the smart people who are working on this will take care of it. And so it's in the back of my mind, and I'm monitoring it. And then I'm seeing over the course of time that, wow, we really aren't doing it. Greenhouse gases are going up. I was born at 320 parts per million, and then we passed 400, and I'm like, wasn't it 350 parts per million we were supposed to go over? And here we are now at 420 parts per million, 100 parts per million more than when I was born, and with no end in sight to increase emissions. And that's when I was thinking, as I'm writing my book, which is about team-based problem solving, kind of the subtext of the book is, how can humanity as a team solve the climate crisis? What does that mean? And after I published the book, right as we were going into pandemic, it was March 2020. And, coincidentally, we stopped getting on airplanes and we stopped commuting to work in my state of California, and the skies got blue and the waters got clear. And it's like, this is what we need to be doing. And then after a while, and we kind of just went back to emitting. And I'm thinking to myself, well, look, we just had this experience. We had some clues. I finished writing my book. Maybe it's time for me to really start to put more effort into applying the principles in the book to solving the climate crisis.
Mm-hmm. And how would you do that, actually? I don't think it would be obvious to some listeners what the connection is between leadership education and consulting and living in less earth-damaging ways. I mean, how are those realms connected in your life and teaching?
Right. So one of the aspects of the Enneagram that's not well understood, which is why I wrote my book, is that the Enneagram is more than a personality system. Now, we know the Enneagram is a personality system with 9 distinct types. And my engineering brain asks the question, why are they numbers? Now, engineers love numbers, right? So that's probably a big attraction to me in the first place. But why? Why numbers? Why not letters or colors or animals or stars or something else? And it turns out that there is a reason why they're numbers. It's because the Enneagram also describes a process. It is the order of the process by which humans solve problems. So it is the human problem-solving process. And once you understand that, it's both a personality system and a problem-solving process with a personality tuned for each step in problem-solving, then you understand how each of these dynamics plays out as you move through problem-solving. And I'm looking at solving the climate crisis as a problem that humanity needs to solve, and we need to collectively move through those 9 steps to solve it. So that was the framing of when I'm looking at the climate crisis, where are we in that process?
So our listenership is global, and I know many of them, regardless of their home country, have a keen interest in the Enneagram. I'll bet that very few of them, though, have thought about their Enneagram type in relationship to earthkeeping. I wonder if you could maybe back up just a bit for those people who aren't familiar with Enneagram, explain that just a bit, and then maybe give us some examples of what in practice could it look like for us to be Enneagram aware as we seek to be part of the solution.
Right. Well, the Enneagram is, I think, a very powerful and meaningful tool for understanding yourself and your own personal motivations. And it describes your Enneagram type as kind of your starting point. And the Enneagram describes 9 distinct styles or 9 distinct starting points. And it doesn't mean that you don't have access to the other dynamics. Each type has more or less ease of access to the other types. So for instance, I'm a type 6, and I have particularly good access to the dynamics of type 3 and the dynamics of type 9, the dynamics of type 5 and 7, the types on either side of my type. So I have pretty easy access to those. I have harder access to some of the other dynamics. Each one of us kind of has that profile of different dynamics that we can access. So one of the really powerful things about it is to understand yourself and what you're good at doing and what you're not so good at doing, which is why you would want to, if you're working with teams through problem solving, it's like, okay, well, maybe I'm not the best at the type 2 dynamic, so it would be good for me to partner with the type 2 to cover that area, right? And then you can start to fill out your team. So this is one of the things that my particular love of the Enneagram comes from that. But I think just at a personal level, it's just so powerful for understanding where you're coming from. Now, I mentioned I'm a type 6, and the type 6 is in the head group or thinking group. And there's 3 distinct centers or groups. There's the gut group, there's the heart group, and there's the head group. One of the big analogies that I use when I describe the Enneagram is the Wizard of Oz, right? You have Dorothy, and she's on her journey, and she encounters these 3 counselors on her way. You know, she encounters the Scarecrow, who represents that thinking center. And then she encounters the Tin Man, who represents that feeling center. And then she encounters the Lion, who represents that gut center. And this really speaks exactly to what's going on with the Enneagram. It describes these 3 intelligences that we all have that are guiding us through life along our way. And we can listen to or ignore each one of these intelligences as we move through. And so this is one of the things I've done on my journey, you know, starting as a head type, a 6, but learning to access my other intelligences, learning to access my feelings and what are my feelings telling me, learning to access my intuition. My gut's another word that's used is intuition. What is my intuition telling me? And then bringing all of that to guiding me as Dorothy in this story to make the best decisions as I move through my life.
Yeah, I think what's coming to mind is I like the clarity that you're offering with that analogy, actually. And it does really, I think, emphasize this idea that to know our strengths means also to know our limitations and therefore to know who we need around us, right? So this is very much an argument for community and acting in concert with other people who are able to do things that we may not be able to do all that well.
Right.
The other thing that comes to mind, though, is that when one knows oneself and one's particular strengths, I think you also begin to discover those things that give you joy, that give you fulfillment, that inspire you. And so perhaps that could lead us to discover, well, what is our particular role, our unique role in Earth care, in working against climate change, for example? Because I do think that sometimes there are a stereotypical 3 or 4 options about what it means to care for the planet, right? It's like write your senator or do a protest or recycle. I think there are limited options, but I think when you start with, here is what I'm good at, here is what I love, here are my passions, that could potentially lead to some really creative thinking in terms of other ways that we can intervene and use the best of ourselves to best effect in terms of Earth care. Would you agree?
Right. Absolutely. Absolutely. And you bring up such a good point, because we're often presented with a very limited number of options, write your senator. But we need to do everything at this point. Carbon has infiltrated all aspects of our life. And we need to decarbonize our lifestyles. And each one of us is going to bring a distinct perspective and strength to that decarbonization process. And since we need everybody to be doing everything, we really just need people to take whatever they're passionate about and apply that in the 3 arenas that we all operate: your personal life, your work life, and your community life, right? And work in each one of those arenas to have conversations about how are we going to decarbonize? How are we going to decarbonize our personal lives? How are we going to decarbonize our community? How are we going to decarbonize our workplaces? And then bring your own passions, whatever that might be. I was talking to a young youth leader the other day who was really passionate about fashion, and that's a big contributor to emissions. And the whole fast fashion trend and the wastefulness and the amount of emissions that come out of that is appalling. And so she described the conversations that she has with her peers, with her family, and also with her elected representatives, of pushing them to make sure that we're not going down a path where we're using materials or bringing in materials that are emitting a lot of emissions. So she's just such a great example of taking something that you're already passionate about and then applying that. And, I'm passionate about teamwork. So here is what I'm doing is I'm trying to figure out how to get teams to address the climate crisis.
So let's say that some of the folks listening to our conversation have never looked into their own Enneagram score. Would you actually recommend that it could be a good thing for them to learn about the Enneagram as a means of discovering their unique capacities for making a difference?
Well, I personally think so. I'm very passionate about the Enneagram. I think in terms of complexity, it does take some work to really understand your perspective. And a starting point is to take an assessment. I have an assessment on my website. It's a complimentary assessment that people are free to use. But I always counsel people that it's better used as a process of elimination.
Huh.
For instance, when I first took the test, my highest score was on type 8. Now, at that time, I was working in a type 8 environment, and I was expected to exhibit type 8 behaviors. And so as you're checking the things, yep, I'm doing that, I'm doing that, I'm doing that, right? So I scored high on 8, but I also scored high on 6. And as I went through the process of understanding each one of those types, okay, the 8 starts more in the gut center where the underlying issue is anger. And then the 6 starts in the head center, and the underlying issue is anxiety. And then thinking about, well, do I start the day more with anger or with anxiety? Am I starting the day kind of just knowing what to do without thinking, or do I have to think through everything? And after you have those conversations with yourself and your family, who often know you better than you do, you can land on, oh yeah, I'm completely a 6. I start the day with anxiety, and I think through all the things I want to do, and then I create a checklist and I start doing them, and then my anxiety goes down, and then I go to bed and I wake up and repeat that. So it's really valuable. And for me personally, when I understood that I was a 6, it was revelatory in that it gave me a name for this thing that I felt in my stomach when I woke up in the morning. And so I had this like little thing in my stomach, and I'm like, oh yeah, there it is. And once I understood the Enneagram, it's like, oh, that's my anxiety. That's my anxiety talking to me. And then I started to just watch it. It's like, oh, I feel it coming up. It's like a thermometer in my abdomen. I can feel it go up or go down depending on how the day was going. And I learned how to better manage it, better control it. Instead of it controlling me, I could control it, and I could just use it as a source of energy. I learned how to practices that would allow me to eliminate it when I didn't want to deal with it anymore. It was very liberating once I understood that it's this anxiety that had been so much a part of my life, and now I was more in control of it than it of me.
Mm-hmm. Well, it's great to know that you offer that resource. We'll definitely put links to it in the show notes, as well as links to information about your book.
Yeah.
I have heard your interviews on other podcasts, and you seem to be able to maintain a really interesting balance between a frankly realistic view of the current climate crisis, but also a stance of, I'll call it unrelenting optimism. And it would be good to hear your thoughts about this, because I know from experience that, the more people confront the extent of damage to the planet that's already been done, or the more a person considers the bleak predictions of where we're actually headed, the easier it is to get discouraged. And I know this is particularly true for my daughter's generation. She's 20. And we had a talk this week about vocations and future. And she told me that when it comes to facing the climate crisis, for her and her friends in particular, the emotions they struggle a lot with range from despair or helplessness and even anger sometimes. Now, obviously, when those feelings are dominant, it's super hard to find the motivation to work for climate solutions. I'm wondering what you would say to my daughter and her friends, or any of us who find it hard to hold on to hope, find that balance between realism, but also not despair.
Right. So you bring up really what's at the core of what I'm trying to accomplish here. And that is, if you look at problem solving, step one is essentially identifying there's a problem. People who know the Enneagram, they'll know that type 1 is often called the perfectionist. And they say the perfectionist is the first one to say, hey, that's not right. It shouldn't be like that. It should be like this. And should is the operating word. And the 1 is in the intuitive center. So they have some intuition about the way things should be. And they're keenly aware when they aren't the way they should be. And so then the second step, that's the type often called the helper. But what they're doing is they're having an emotional connection. So you're now going into that heart group. And the way to look at it in problem solving is, who cares? If you have a problem and nobody cares about it, then it's not going to get solved. And so really what we need to do at this point, when I just look at the highest level of where we are as humanity, we are entering into step 2. And we just need more people to care. And once we have a critical mass of people who care, then that generates the political will to actually do something. Now, there are many forces in the world that are preventing us from caring or distracting us or keeping us in kind of a state of denial or status quo. And it's very easy to do. And one of the reasons why it's easy for them to do that is because, like your daughter has experienced, if you actually confront it, it's painful. And people are averse to going into that space. But if they do go into that space, then guess what? That means they've entered step 2, because that's exactly the right response to the climate crisis. Is like, oh, wow, And so once you enter into that space, then you're going to go through essentially what I see analogous to a grieving process. And what grieving is experiencing a sense of loss or anticipated loss. And that's what's really happening, right? We are going to lose a lot of things. We're going to lose our expectations of our fun, high energy, fossil fueled lifestyles. We're going to lose a lot of ecodiversity and species diversity. And of course, we're going to lose a lot of humanity too. We see what's happening in Pakistan right now. We have the population the size of Texas now displaced because of these huge floods. Can you imagine that? I mean, it's just hard to imagine. And so here's the thing. Once you actually start to care and you really start to appreciate, then there's no point at which it makes sense to give up. There's no point. Anything that you do will benefit. So do something. Do something. Once you care, you can move into a space where you can start to do the things that you're passionate about. And that is an antidote for those feelings, especially if you find a like-minded community. Say you're passionate about fashion, for instance, and you want to build a sustainable way for people to be able to clothe themselves without emitting a lot of fossil fuels. And you're passionate about it. You find other people who are passionate about it, and then you can work towards doing that. And this is one of the things that gives you the most hope, is because the Enneagram, when I work with teams, I find that people have migrated just organically to something that they're good at, that is really suitable for their Enneagram type. And this happens in the climate space as well. People, once they have those feelings and they care, the 3s are going to go start some new project and be successful. And the 4s are going to start creating really cool art. And the 5s are going to be our scientists and do all the research. And the 6s are going to become emergency managers and risk planners. And the 7s are going to be out there networking with people and bringing people to, everybody's going to jump to the thing they love to do. And because that's already happening, if you look at problem solving, you already have all these activities in step 3, step 4, step 5, all the way around. It's just we're stuck collectively at step 2. And once we break the dam there and really move a lot of people into that step 2, we'll find that because all these other people have laid the groundwork for what we can do and what is possible and what's already happening, it can move really fast. It can move really fast. It's not a linear process. And so that's why I'm so passionate about just finding ways to get people to care, bring them into that caring space, and helping them work through those difficult emotions, getting them to acceptance, And then it's like, okay, now what do I do? And now you be you do the thing you're passionate about, because we all need to do everything. There's no wrong thing to do as long as it's moving towards decarbonization.
Something really important in what you just said is that idea of mourning, of grieving, of working through. I think there are perhaps some folks who would recommend that we skip over that. It's like, just be hopeful, just find your optimism, we can do this. And I think that kind of frustrates the move then to creative, courageous solutions, because we're not responding in a realistic way. We're just avoiding it in a way. But you're right, to look at the losses that we're about to face, or we are facing, if we aren't feeling despair, if we aren't feeling anger, we're probably not actually facing reality. We're not actually realizing what's happening. And it seems to me that you're recommending that we must actually work through that, acknowledge it, feel it, in order then to say, all right, based on those things, where will I find my motive then to make some important decisions about my place, my role, the thing I can do and have passion for in terms of making the world a better place. Is that fair?
Yes, and I'll elaborate on that a little bit, because I'm going to just highlight type 7 here for a minute. Now, type 7, they are the optimists. They're the adventure. They want to have fun. They are averse to feelings of grief and loss, and they will avoid that, which is completely fine. It's completely fine that they do that, because that is them. I think there's enough other types that have the ability to work through that process and come into it without requiring that everybody come into it.
Sure.
And you can still be, as a type 7, passionate and hopeful without having gone through that. And the way that type 7s can come into it without having actually dealt with the grief is by being in a community. Mm-hmm. Like, if you're building a community of people that have a mission and a purpose, the 7s will be fine to join that. And maybe many or most of that community may have already gone through that grieving cycle, but they've built a community that has formed this strong bond and that given them purpose and mission. And then the 7s can just come in on top of that and do their 7 contribution. Now, I met, and thank you for listening, I do some interviews with climate leaders because I want to understand their perspective. I think at some point, we all are going to become climate leaders.
Sure.
And so I want to really provide, guidance for people who are starting to have feelings and, be relatable to, say, if I'm a 7 and I'm starting to have these feelings, I want to hear from another 7 how they felt. Oh, that's similar to me. What did you do about it? Oh, that's what you did about it. So that's the whole purpose of my interviews with climate leaders, is to just be there as a resource for people who are moving into the space and becoming climate leaders themselves, because we're all going to become climate leaders. But one of the interviews that I did with this young woman who organizes essentially a network of groups. So it's essentially coordinating. It's called the Climate Mobilization Group. It's TCM. And so they coordinate with a bunch of different climate groups. And the young woman who is kind of coordinating all of this, that was my contact, was a type 7. And so I wanted to interview her to understand, oh, wow, here's this precious thing, a type 7 in the climate movement. And so we started the conversation. She knew that she was a type 7. So I asked her, it's like, it's really rare. I don't see a lot of type 7s in the climate movement because they're so averse to the negativeness that goes on. She says, yeah, and I think, and this is paraphrasing her words, she says, I am neurodiverse. I'm on the autism spectrum, and because I am not reacting to those negative emotions the way most 7s would react, it allows me to stay in that space and just work people through it without having the reactions that would drive most 7s away from that situation. And I just thought that was so fascinating and so much self-awareness about not only herself, but of type 7s and their inclinations. It really just brought home how important it is not only to have diversity in Enneagram types, but diversity from all perspectives. Your gender, race, where you came from, where you were born, where you grew up, and then also your neurodiversity, maybe being on the autism spectrum can be a very powerful tool for helping us work through the climate crisis. So just reminded me of the fact that we need everybody to solve this.
Yeah. It's interesting. In my conversation with my daughter, she ended up in a similar place. She said, the one thing I have realized is that I cannot do this alone. If we don't figure out how to do this together in community, it's just not going to happen. And, I know that in a head level, but somehow that just really hit my heart. And it was a profound moment for me to hear her say that, and maybe a heartening moment to hear someone from her generation say that, because I think it's hard to have that perspective that there is a way forward. But I appreciate hearing you say a similar thing, this value of diversity, that we must be in this together. We must become dependent on one another for one another's perspectives, wisdom, and strength. So I appreciate that message very much.
Yeah. And I appreciate what you're doing too, because you're building a community here. You're talking about the climate. And sometimes people ask me, well, what can I do? And I'll say the single most important thing that you could do is just talk about it.
Yeah.
Because if you don't bring it up, nobody else will bring it up, because it is kind of a form of, a defense mechanism. And that's why even the people who really understand that we're in a climate crisis, and yet they kind of still are going through their lives as if we're going to carry on, that is a form of denial. One of the things that is, I've seen this meme lately where there's a dog sitting at a kitchen table with a cup of coffee, and all around him there's smoke and there's fire in the room, and the dog's just sitting there with his coffee smiling. And then the next pane over is like, this is fine.
Exactly.
Right? And what that's speaking to is one of our unconscious biases called the normalcy bias. And what we are trying to do is just carry on as if everything is fine, just kind of preserving the status quo, even when things are burning around us. So coming into that space of realizing, oh, there is a fire here. And then I don't want to just sit here and drink my coffee. I want to get a fire extinguisher. I want to get a hose. I want to start doing something, right? That's when you click over into action. And, that's what we need to be doing.
Yeah, absolutely.
But the starting point is normalcy bias, because another one of the biases is, you look around to see what other people are doing. It's like, oh, nobody else is doing anything. Okay, well then I guess everything's okay, right? And that's the importance of starting the conversation is not everything's okay. It's not okay. There is a fire in the house, and we need to get a fire extinguisher, and we need to stop burning fossil fuels. Would you mind sharing your Enneagram type if you know it?
Yeah, it's 5. I have a similar story. I used to be 8, right? But I realized, as you did, that it was only 8 because I needed to be 8 in certain contexts. But when I began to realize I didn't really like doing a lot of the 8 stuff so much, I began to listen more to my heart, which brought me back to 5. So I'm thoroughly 5 at this point, and maybe even leaning towards 6. Yeah.
Right. And because, one of the things that you're doing here is it's a very 7 activity, going and having conversations and building community. And so here is a great example of how then there is a connection between the 5 and the 7, right? So the 5 has connections to the 7, the 8, the 6, which you mentioned, and the 4. So those are the ones that are easy for you to access, right? So even if we're not able to bring in the 7s yet because it's a little too painful, the fives can step in and do 7 things, which you're doing. So thank you so much for doing this for us. I so appreciate it.
That's really helpful. Matt, talk to us a bit about practicalities. Like, these are great ideas, great principles, great values, but when it comes to translating that into action, how do you advise people? How do you help them to get to that place of moving on what they care about in terms of earth care?
Right. Yeah, and I think this gets back to something that we spoke about earlier, both knowing your Enneagram type and what you're passionate about and what motivates you and drives you, right? So that gives you some guidance for you. And then the other thing is think about what you can do in each one of these realms in your life, your personal life, your community life, and your work life. Because in each one of these spaces, you do have people that you can influence, including yourself, and you can influence them by example and by taking actions, showing people you're taking actions, talking about those actions. And, I'm at the point now where I'm not a type 1, so I don't use, you should do this, right? My approach is, I'm just doing this. Like, I have a friend who lent me a solar-powered bike. And so whenever I can, and I'm just going to run errands around my community, I get on my solar-powered bike and I ride around. And of course, it has solar panels on it and it's motorized and I'm zipping along and it gets a lot of attention. And then I'll stop and then people will come over and talk to me and ask me about it and why I'm doing it. And so I could just start a conversation right there, right in my community, just by doing that. And it's almost like leading by example. And then it influences my family as well. It's like, Dad, why don't you just take the car? No, I'm going to get on the bike and I'm going to, do this. It's going to take a few more minutes, but it's important. So in each one of these areas, you can just lead by example. So I gave you an example of my personal life. I gave you an example of how I can show that off in the community and my work life too. Before pandemic, I did travel by plane quite frequently. And when you're in the status quo, you're not thinking about it too much. And then once pandemic hit and, it really taught me that, I can do my consulting without getting on a plane. I do not need to get on a plane to do that. I've been doing workshops virtually, Enneagram workshops, teamwork workshops. I could do all of that virtually. And I have this wonderful group of people that I work with who have just become so facile with all of the virtual tools. We can create these very engaging and fun workshops. And so, it's like, I don't need to do this. And there was one partner that I had who was insisting that I get on an airplane and join him and some other people for a conference. And I said, you know what? I'm not going to do that anymore. So we know we can do this virtually. We did it virtually last year. So I understand if you want to get together in person, but please just make an accommodation. Allow me to participate virtually. I'm happy to participate. I'll be there. I just want to be on a screen because I don't want to get on an airplane. I don't want to get on an airplane and burn those fossil fuels. And this fellow that I'm talking to, he's a smart guy and he's very aware that there's a problem. And he's like, yeah, I know. I'm planning on getting some carbon credits to compensate for my fossil fuel usage. And I'm like, yeah, you're going to, plant some trees somewhere that might get burned down in a forest fire. No, that's not what we need to be doing. We need to, first and foremost, stop burning fossil fuels. So don't get on the airplane and don't burn the fossil fuels. That gets right to the root cause of the problem. And so it was a difficult conversation with him because he was quite insistent that I do this. And I was quite insistent that I wasn't going to do it. And so it's not easy sometimes to have these conversations, but it's important. And it leaves a very strong impression with those around you when you make that commitment to doing this and you explain to them, we need to stop burning fossil fuels. So I'm going to stop burning fossil fuels. I'm going to do everything I can to stop burning fossil fuels. And it gets people to think then. And so this is one of the important things I think we all need to be doing at this point.
I think what I like about this is that you're really leading not just by example, but almost leading by intrigue. We want people to be curious. So how can you live in a way that you're not flaunting your green actions self-righteously, right? But instead you're doing it in a way that's invitational, that invites people to ask questions. I mean, I love that solar bike idea. I would so stop you in the street and say, what are you riding? I must look into this. So love that prop, but a prop that is actually making a difference. It's beautiful.
Right. And that happens all the time when I'm riding the bike. It's a real attention grabber.
Yeah.
And you're right. It's inviting people in. It's inviting people to engage in a way that is not off-putting. So now another activity that I've undertaken is to, I think we talked about youth leaders, and there's this one youth leader that probably people are familiar with, Greta Thunberg. And she's a very passionate climate activist who says we need to stop burning fossil fuels. And she holds her elected representatives to account by doing a school strike every Friday. And that might not be for everybody, and I found that it's not for everybody. But to me, it makes total sense. It just makes total sense for so many reasons. One is because it makes sure that climate is in the conversation at least once a week, hopefully more, but at least it brings some attention, And so we have a group now. We go out in front of our city hall. We have these wonderful signs, and we're out there engaging with the community as they walk past, and I just always ask people, hey, how are you feeling about climate? And I listen. And it's amazing. People are feeling things about climate, and then people will come over and stop and sit down, and we'll have a snack together and a drink together. It's all outside, so it's safe, COVID safe, and it's a great way to just engage with the community while also engaging with our elected leaders, because guess what? We do it at noon, and they come out of City Hall and they pass by us and they see us and they stop and have conversations. And in fact, now our group has a relationship with the city sustainability manager that we happen coincidentally to be meeting 2 hours from now this afternoon for a conversation. And so we have a regular meeting with her, usually about once a month, and she gives us an update on what the city is doing and what we could be doing to push, because you need to push a little bit. Democracy isn't just voting. It's actually participating. So we get the information about what's working, what's not working, where they're stuck. And then I will go to my city council meeting, which is once a week. And again, I can do the virtual participation. So I could do it from right here at my desk and attend the city council meeting, prepare a 2 or 3 minute little talk about an issue that I may have heard about in our city, and just let them know how important it is that we need to keep making progress. And our city does have a very aggressive carbon emissions reduction goal, but we also need a plan, an action plan, and then we need action. So we can't just have the goal. And so that's one of the things our group is doing, is encouraging them to actually get to those steps of action. And so we have all of these different areas that we're moving forward, with the conversations, the interaction with the city, and then encouraging them to move forward.
2 words that jump out at me, actually, in all that you've just said are listening and encouraging, because you talked about how you are encountering people on the street and you ask them, how are you feeling? And, I don't know that that's always the approach that people take, especially people who care passionately about climate change and earth care. Oftentimes we start with our message. We start with what we think is urgent, and we may even start with our directives. But I think your stance of listening first seems very important to me. It allows people to bring their concerns out. And maybe I think it enables you to actually find those points of conversation that are most relevant to them as well. What do they need to talk about?
Exactly.
What do you need to discover together in that conversation? Unless you're
Right.
listening deeply and carefully, you're never going to get to that place.
Right. And this is precisely an Enneagram approach because, again, I think that we're collectively trying to get people into step 2, which is caring and feeling. So that's why, to me, it's the perfect question. It's the perfect question to bring them in to a conversation about caring. And when I ask that question, then most people do have a feeling about a problem. And when you ask that question, they will tell you how climate change is a problem for them,
Sure.
for their perspective, right? And you make such a great point because if you've already moved around and you're already advocating for something, it's like no plastic. We need to, whatever you're passionate about, and we need everything. But that issue might not resonate with that person. So I want to bring everybody in and I want to get them engaged in what they're passionate about. And so that's why I asked that question is like, I'm listening for what are you passionate about? And then hopefully connecting them with an action that they can take that addresses the problem from their perspective and addresses those feelings that they're having by hopefully connecting them with people who are feeling similarly about that same thing. And believe me, there are people. So it's just connecting all these people.
We've been in conversation with Matt Schlegel about using the Enneagram to help us understand the unique roles we each might play in earthkeeping and to help us get others involved in the work of tackling climate change by connecting it to their particular strengths and passions. If you want to know more about Matt's work, you'll find helpful links in the podcast show notes. And if you want to see a picture of Matt and his solar-powered bike, you'll find that on the podcast website at circlewood.online/Earthkeepers. Also, I'll be doing a special Q&A episode with James when we transition to Season 4. So if you have a question or comment on any of the episodes from the past year, or have an uncomfortably personal question for James, use the voice message function on the podcast webpage or send us an email at earthkeepers@circlewood.online. I'm Forrest Inslee, your podcast host. Our executive producer is James Amadon. Our producer is Dave Wolfers. Forrest Reed is the creator of our original music, and Timothy Connor is our podcast editor. Our research assistant is Alex Meggerly, and Jesselyn Gentry is our social media director. Thank you, friends, for listening, and please join us for our next conversation on the Earthkeepers podcast.